All right, so today we're talking about independent and dependent variables, but focused more on word problems and using them to write equations and find values. So just a couple of reminders from lesson one. The independent variable is the quantity that's being changed or manipulated. The dependent variable is the quantity whose value depends on the independent variable. And remember, we gave you these other names, the manipulated amount or the starting quantity or the input. And then there are also some other names for a dependent variable, the responding amount or the ending quantity or the output. So remember, we were always kind of looking at this dependent variable and saying, how does it relate back to that independent variable? So I'm going to show you really quickly an example that we did earlier in the year where we made an input-output table. So I just want to kind of remind you guys how we relate these equations to tables and also to our input and output, which is the same thing as our independent and our dependent variable. So remember, if we start to plug in these x values into the y value, right? This is my input, then I get this output for y. If I plug in -2 and go out to my equation, 2 times -2 is -4, and then -4 plus 4 obviously cancel each other out, makes 0. If I input -1, -1 times 2 is -2, -2 plus 4 gives me 2, right? If I plug in 0, 2 times 0 is 0, 0 plus 4 gives me 4. If I plug in 1, 2 times 1 plus 4 gives me 2 plus 4, which is 6. And then 2 times 2 is 4. So 2 times 2 plus 4 gives me 8. So we've actually looked at this idea of independent and dependent variables before because we've made these tables many times throughout the year. So in this situation, x is my independent variable and y is my dependent variable, right? Y depends on what the x value is. So it's just basically a different way using independent and dependent of describing something we've really talked about before. And I also just want to remind you that we could even go through and graph all of these points, right? Remember when we would use these and say, here's my xy point, -2 on x and 0 for y, and then we could draw that line through them, and that will be an equation. We're not going to get to this today. We're mostly just going to talk about these equations and how we can find the y value based on what the x value is. I just want to keep this in mind for you guys because we have talked about this a little bit before. Okay, so here's our first example. It asks us, it tells us one of the clubs at school is planning on selling t-shirts to raise money. The club plans on selling the t-shirts for $8 each at lunch. Our job is to write an equation to describe how much money the club makes from selling t-shirts, depending on, that's an important word right there, depending on how many t-shirts they sell. So it says depending on how many shirts they sell. I'm going to underline that or highlight that. Because that's kind of important, right? Something is depending on how many shirts that they sell. That means that the number of shirts that they sell is doing its own thing, right? Something else is depending on that. So that's not our dependent variable. That means that our independent variable is actually how many shirts they sell. Well, what depends on how many shirts they sell? It tells us we're trying to figure out how much money the club actually makes, right? So the amount of money that the club makes depends on the number of shirts that they sell. That means that the dependent variable is the number or the dollars or the money that the club makes, right? The money that the club makes depends on how many shirts that they sell. So if we sell a lot of shirts, then we'll make a lot of money for our club. If we don't sell a lot of shirts, we're not going to make a lot of money for our club. So we need to actually write an equation though to describe this. So just like we had in our last example where we made the nice little table and we said that x was our independent variable and y depended on what x was, we're always for now going to call our independent variable x and our dependent variable y, right? X is the input, how many shirts they sell, and y is the output or the money that the club makes. So I'm always going to start my equation as y equals, right? I'm trying to figure out what y is or how much money the club makes, and then write something that has something to do with x, right? So if we know that the t-shirts are selling for $8 each, I'm going to write an equation that looks like this. So y, the number of money the club, or the number of dollars or the money that the club makes is going to be equal to $8 times the number of shirts that they sell, right? So if they sell one t-shirt, 8 times 1, they're going to make $8, right? If they sell 2 t-shirts, 8 times 2, they're going to make $16, right? So we can kind of keep plugging in numbers, inputs for X to figure out how much money the club actually makes. So what do we do with this equation, right? We have this equation, y equals 8x. Now we want to know if the club sells 20 t-shirts, how much money did they make? I personally don't like to think about having to add money up on my fingers, right? 8, 16, 24, 32, right? Having to count all the way up to 20 multiples of 8. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to this equation and say, well, this is my independent variable, right? I can plug this in, make this an input in my equation and get my output, which is the money that the club is making. So I'm going to plug it in instead of having to count all the way up to 20 multiples of 8. And y is going to equal 8 times 20, right? $8 per shirt times 20 shirts. So that gets me to $160 for y. So that's how much money the club actually makes. Okay, so on the second example, we have a yoga club charging each member $15 for going on their annual club yoga retreat to the top of Mount Rainier. Isn't it beautiful? The club already has $100 in their account to pay for the trip. So we want to write an equation to describe how much money the yoga club has for the trip, depending on how many members go. So once again, I'm going to kind of highlight this word depending and say, okay, depending on how many members go. If we're trying to depend on how many members go, that means that how many members go is independent of everything, right? We could have 5 members go, we could have 100 members go, but that doesn't really matter, right? So the independent variable is how many members go. Well, what depends on how many members go? If we go back to the beginning of this little piece right here, it asks us to describe how much money the yoga club actually has for the trip. Okay, so that means what the dependent variable is how much money the club has for the trip again, right? So the money that the club has for the trip here depends on how many members go, right? If 5 members go on the trip, you're not going to have as much money as if 100 members go on the trip. So here's an interesting thing though, when we write this equation, we know that we're going to have $15 for every member, right? But then we just kind of have this extra $100 amount in their account. So when I write my equation, I'm always going to start with that y equals, but then I'm going to have $15 for every member, right? Because X represents members. So I'm going to say 15 times X, right? So if 1 member goes, that's $15. If 2 members goes, that's $30. But they also have this extra $100 in their account. So if you kind of ever have this extra amount that doesn't really depend on one of the variables, you can just kind of add it or subtract it in some cases. But here we're going to be adding it to the total amount, right? Because that $100 does go into the total amount of money that the club has for the trip. So we have $15 for every member and an additional $100. And all of this money altogether gives us the money to pay for the yoga trip. So again, what are we going to actually do with this equation? Well, we had 7 members who signed up or who are able to go on the trip. We want to know how much money does the club have to spend on this trip. So all we have to do is go back to this equation and do our input-output piece. So I have 7 members, right? We said that the members is the independent variable or the input that goes into my equation. So I'm going to do 15 times 7, right? 15 times 7, and then I'm going to also add 100. Because that was kind of the extra money that they had in their account. So 15 times 7 is 105. So from those members, right, we have $105 to spend plus our extra $100. So total, we have $205 to spend on this yoga trip. You can buy some nice, yummy trail mix to take on the trip with us. A lot of trail mix for $205. So now that you've watched those 2 examples, go and complete the lesson 2 form. There are 3 questions or 3 kind of sections that you need to work through, 3 different scenarios, and let us know if you have any questions.